Here are the parts that you will need for this job. You'll need your new rotors, and if you're putting in new brake pads, you'll need the new brake pads, and they may or may not come with hardware. If they do come with their new hardware, you'll install that too. If they don't, you'll just reuse the old ones and just clean them up nicely. These are the tools that you're going to need for this job. You're going to need a ratchet, either a 1/2 inch with a nice long extension, or maybe you'll need a breaker bar. You could use a 3/8 as well if you have a long enough extension. 14 and 17 millimeter sockets. You need a flathead screwdriver. You're going to need a brake spreader, or if you don't have that, you can use a C-clamp to push back the caliper piston. You need a torque wrench at the end to torque everything back up to spec. And then you may also need a hammer, just in case you struggle to get that rotor off. These are the shop supplies that you're going to need for this job. It's always nice to wear a pair of gloves. You're going to need some anti-seize, some brake cleaner, some disc brake caliper lube, or some grease that will work on there. With takes a very high temperature. Some thread locker if you want to use that, and then of course a pair of safety glasses. So now when it comes to the vehicle, what you want to do is just put your sleeve on there for your lug nuts, and then either take a breaker bar, or if you have a ratchet with a long handle, that'll be pretty easy. Just slide that on, and what you're going to do is you're just going to break them loose. You're not going to take them off at this time, but make sure you got them all broken loose. And once you've done that, now you're going to jack up your vehicle. Make sure your rear wheels are chocked, and put jack stands underneath the vehicle to get it ready for your brake job. Now that you've broken the nuts loose and you've jacked it up, got your jack stands underneath, now you just take out all your lug nuts. As you take off the wheel, it's always good just to put it underneath the chassis of the vehicle. Just slide it underneath, just for safety's sake. Sometimes I'm starting with the left. It's easier just to turn your front wheels to the left so that the caliper is easily accessible from outside of the vehicle. Okay, so now what we're going to do, this is our caliper, and it's held on by two 14 millimeter bolts. We'll undo the one down here, we'll lift up the caliper, and then we'll take out the brake pads that are situated just inside here. Once you've broken it loose, it just comes out with your fingers like that, just a short bolt. And now you could just use a flathead screwdriver and just pry up like that. So now as you lift this up, you can just secure it to the strut with a bungee cord. Just like that. Now you have access to take out these brake pads. You'll see you've got these two pins that keep them in place. These brake pads are still in pretty good shape, so I won't be putting in new ones, but it'll be the same procedure if you want to put new ones in. I do have to replace the rotors though, so I'll be doing that. They just slide out like that. Once you've taken out the brake pads, you can just lower your caliper again. The main thing is this brake line over here. You don't want this to be under pressure, and you don't want weight to be hanging on that, so that could break or be damaged in any way. Now you just take your bolt at the bottom, the caliper bolt here, and you just put that in by hand, just like that. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take off the caliper mounting bolts, the two big ones at the back, and those are 17 millimeters for this vehicle. Okay, so now when we take off these bolts, this is the caliper, bottom caliper bracket bolt, and this is the top one. These are both 17 millimeters, and as I've said, they're on at about 79 foot-pounds, so that's pretty tight. You want to use either a breaker bar or a 1/2-inch drive with a long handle to give you some leverage to get these off. As we have said, we want to protect your brake hose over here. So when you take out the last mounting bolt, you want to hold on firmly to the caliper bracket. Don't let it drop. And then you want to pick it up, and then you are going to tie it up with a bungee cord here to the strut. Now what you want to do is remove your rotor, and this should just slide right off. If it doesn't, then it needs to be persuaded. You could use a dead blow hammer like this, or since I'm going to replace it anyway, you could just use any hammer just to give it a tap, and it comes right off like that. Now that you have your rotor off, you want to just inspect your hub. If you have a lot of rust on there, you want to take care of that. In my case, it's not too bad. So just give this a wipe. Once you've given it a wipe, now you can just take some anti-seize and put some on there. So next time you take this off, it should come off pretty easily. Now when your rotor comes in the packaging like this, it's going to have some oil on there which prevents it from rusting, which is great, but that's not what you want when you install it, because the oil will obviously not work with your brakes. So you want to take this off, undo it, and then you want to clean it thoroughly with some brake clean. Make sure you wipe it well on both sides to get all that oily residue off there. See what that looks like. That will not work with your brakes. You might have to do this a few times until there's no more residue on there. Once you've got your brake rotor nice and clean, you'll just mount it. So just do up just one lug nut to keep it in place while you put the brakes on. So our next step now is just going to be to take the caliper mount and put that back on. The two bolts at the back, as we've said before, we will torque them down to 79 foot-pounds. So now what you want to do is you want to just torque these guys down. So you want both of them at 79 foot-pounds. I'm just going to put a second lug nut on here, just on the other side, to make sure we've got the rotor nicely in. There we go. Then we're going to open this up and look at the hardware inside there. So we're taking off this bolt down here, and we're going to lift up the caliper and just secure it with a bungee to the strut. Now if you didn't get any new hardware with your brakes, then you're going to just take this out, and you just want to clean this off with a wire brush. When you've got them reasonably clean, just replace them again. They just go straight in. And same for the other side. Then you do the top. Now that we've got them nice and clean, we're going to just add a bit of anti-seize right at the bottom here, because this is where the brake pad slides on. Very small amount of anti-seize, just a tad inside of these. We don't want it to get onto the brake rotor itself, so we don't want to put too much on there, but just enough so that the brake pads can slide easily and not get bound up. The next thing we want to do is get our brake pads on, and what we'll do is we'll just take just a tiny bit of anti-seize and put that right on the back of the brake pad, so that when it makes contact with the caliper piston, it won't seize up, but it'll just push straight in. Now you take your brake pads and you line them up, and then push them in, just like that. Now we go to the other side. So this wear indicator was at the top, and that's how we'll fit it back in. Now the next thing you want to do is move your caliper piston back in. If your new brake pads are thicker than the old worn ones, and so the caliper piston will be further out, and you need to push it back in to make room for your new thicker pads. And probably the easiest way to do it is take an old pad, put it in there, and put your brake spreader tool and just get that up there, and then as you apply the pressure, it just moves it in very slowly. There we go. And you move it all the way back in and make space for your new brake pads. If you don't have a brake spreader like this, you could just use a C-clamp, get that in there and push it all the way back. The next thing we're going to do is check our caliper slide pins. This one is going to just pull right out. It doesn't look all that good, so we'll just clean this up. We'll lubricate this again and it'll go back in. For cleaning, you can just spray it with some brake clean, and then just give it a really good wipe. I just cleaned this up a little bit on the wire wheel, and now I'm just going to add some of this ultra disc brake caliper lube, or you can use silicone paste, but it just needs to be able to withstand very high temperatures, which you get when you use the brakes. So we'll just coat this. We'll just coat this with a lube, and then it's gonna go right back in. All right, when that's in, you just push that straight back in. And once it's in, you'll test it. It'll just slide very easily. Now we'll take off the bolt on the top here, and then look at that sliding pin. Just be careful that you don't damage the brake line. This looks in better shape than the other one, but I'll just clean it up and give it some new lube. It just slides right back in. Just hand tighten the bolt up here. Then you can undo your bungee cord. And the caliper just goes right back down. The bottom bolt goes in by hand. And then you're going to torque these two bolts 25 foot-pounds. Once you've got these 25, then it's just time to put the wheel back on, and then you're done. Okay, now I just straighten the wheel again. I'm going to take off these two lug nuts, and then it's just a matter of putting the wheel back on and tightening it down, put the vehicle back on the ground, and then torque it back up to spec. On my Sienna, it's 77 foot-pounds for the lug nuts, but I like to do them at 80. It's worked well for me in the past, and so I think I'll continue to do that. So once the wheel is on and torqued up to spec, you can just go for a test drive. And that's a job well done.